Ladies and gentlemen, buenos dias, good morning. I am incredibly impressed to see so many people here at 9 o'clock in the morning on the second day of the forum. I think we've broken a record, and I think there's a very good reason for that, because we have a very special speaker who is joining us today. One of my colleagues, Wilhelmine Bax, who is so instrumental in the success of the forum, she uses an expression, which is, we want people who rock the room. This is the OECD. Getting people who rock the room is not necessarily always the easiest thing. And the OECD's idea of rocking the room and normal people's ideas of rocking the room sometimes don't necessarily totally coincide. However, I think today we are going to get a strong part of the way there. At the outset, I would like to express my thanks to Ambassador Claudia Serrano, whose idea it was really to bring Alejandro to the forum and to OECD Week this year. I think without that initiative, he might not have come, but we hope now that you taste the forum, this will not be the last time that you come to us. So I'm just going to briefly introduce Alejandro to you. Firstly, why he's here is to be able to address some of the key themes that we're discussing in the forum this year. Addressing income and spatial inequality and improving people's well-being. And at the end of the session, we will show Alejandro briefly one of the OECD's initiatives, the Better Life Index, to see how much what he does may actually impinge on quality of life and the measures that we have been developing. So he's often been depicted as the most socially aware architect of his generation. He graduated in architecture from the Pontificia Universidad Católica de Chile in 1992 and has a long-standing record of work on institutional buildings. Since 2001, he's been the executive director of Elemental, which describes itself as a do tank. Where have we heard that before? The OECD is described by Ángel Gurría as a do tank, so we have many things in common, I can see. Ángel Gurría, the Secretary General of the OECD. Yesterday, well, he's been saying it for a while, actually. No, because he became Secretary General in 2006. But he didn't like the idea of us being a think tank, which is sort of somehow theoretical, but actually going from theory to practice. So there are some elements of commonality there. Elemental focuses on projects of public interest and social impact. And this year, Alejandro was awarded the prestigious Pritzker Architecture Prize, and he's also the director of the 16th edition of the International Architecture Exhibition at La Biennale in Venice. And I think he's actually been there recently. His achievements include a wide range of social housing projects following Elemental's principles of incrementality, a participatory and inclusive design process involving communities and people. And by way of example, we have the Siamese Towers for Digital Technology, the UC Innovation Center, St. Edward's University residence in Texas, the Shanghai Novartis campus, the Sustainable Urban Plan for the mining town of Calama in Chile, and the Santiago Metropolitan Promenade and Children's Park. In 2010, after the earthquake in Chile, Alejandro was asked to redesign the city of Santiago with the Sustainable Reconstruction Plan for Constitución, the area of Santiago, which happens to be the area that one of our good friends, Pablo Lorenzini, is from. I hope Pablo is here with us. Yes, good. He will tell us more about this incredible endeavor a little bit later. And these projects have been recognized with awards such as the London Design Museum's Designs of the Year in 2015, the Silver Lion from the 11th Venice Biennale back in 2008, and it's featured in a number of other very esteemed award ceremonies. He was a visiting professor at the Graduate School of Design at Harvard for 5 years through to 2005. And has been a fellow of the Royal Institute of British Architects since 2010. I've almost done. He also he was telling me that he's just been, probably in his trip to Venice, he met with Matteo Renzi, who will be chairing the G7 meeting very soon, and who I think has some ideas in terms of how he could involve Alejandro in what they might do to create the right context for that very important international engagement. Couple of quotes which I found fascinating. Architecture's halfway between art and survival. I just throw that out now because it is 9 in the morning. Get your heads around that. Take a little bit of time. In about 20-25 minutes, you'll be able to ask him questions. It's also about a balance between rigor and hope. And something that I read in an article which is in French, so I will do my best to try and render this into English. Our biggest challenge is to respond to questions that have nothing to do with architecture. Poverty, segregation, violence, insecurity, education, and inequality. So I hope you will actually contradict that in what you have to say, because perhaps architecture has everything to do with addressing many of those issues. The floor is yours, Alejandro.
Well, thank you so much for the invitation and for coming here so early. As you were saying, I was opening the Venice Biennale last Saturday, and Biennale, which is the most important architectural show in the world, is not about the advancement of architecture. It's about the advancement and improving of the quality of life of people. We just happen as architects to contribute to such a goal through architecture, but it's not a goal in itself, it's just a mean. And I guess from very different backgrounds, you are trying to do the same. So what I will try to do here is just to show how we architects can engage and transform in a very concrete way to organize all information in a proposal key. So understand the forces at play, the diagnosis and the problems, but not just stop in raising awareness, translate that into proposals. And I guess one of the most important fields where that ultimately has a very physical, concrete manifestation is cities. The question is, are cities going to be magnets or attractors of knowledge, ideas, people, resources, or are they going to be ticking time bombs? I guess a little bit of both. So the presentation is about to understand which kind of forms of the city can lead to one or the other. So this is a little bit of the plan of this morning. I will start somewhere here, arrive over there.
That's very OECD, we like that.
So to start with, cities are not just accumulation of houses, but concentration of opportunities. Opportunities of jobs, education, access to sanitation, health, transportation, even recreation. And by being concentrated in space, they can be, on the one hand, very powerful vehicles to create and generate wealth. Simultaneously, they can work as shortcuts towards equality. So on the first side, let's say on the positive aspects, and cities as magnets, and these vehicles able to create wealth. This is, of course, not my idea. I heard it to many economists, particularly one, Rakesh Mohan, that was saying that the competitiveness in the future will be more and more based on knowledge creation. And for that to happen, there are a couple of conditions in the kind of world that we're living. First one, that those knowledge creators tend to earn more or less the same anywhere in the world. And they're kind of salary nomads. And they choose where to live depending on the quality of life that cities are able to offer. In the first world, the challenge is to be able to attract, like these magnets, these knowledge creators. For the third world and countries like ours, the challenge is to retain those knowledge creators. So let's say an airplane engineer in Brazil or in Latin America maybe had enough of the threat of children being kidnapped after school, earning more or less the same. He may eventually leave for Lockheed or Boeing or whatever kind of thing. So we do have to create in our countries conditions that improve not only the quality of life, but that is the correct inequalities. So the anger, the insecurity, the violence, and the resentment gets dissolved. Otherwise, we would lose those able to push and pull the vehicle of wealth. So that's one thing, salary nomads. Second thing, knowledge creation happens in face-to-face contacts. Forget the internet, forget the social media and all the technology. That's actually, I guess, why you come here at 9 a.m. in the morning. We need to meet, physically meet. 95% of the communication is non-verbal. It's the body language, it's the way you breathe, the way you generate confidence or not. So I guess that every single crucial discovery in mankind, in knowledge, will take place in face-to-face contacts. The more people is concentrated in space, the more likely that critical mass may create relevant, significant encounters among people and eventually knowledge may appear. So from that point of view, we do have a responsibility, a challenge, and an opportunity in making cities such environments to be able to perform as these magnets and this creative environment for knowledge. But this on the good side. Let's say on a more threatening side, I guess that there's an agreement that we may be better off in terms of poverty, but we are worse in terms of inequality. So what tends to create the social conflicts in the world is not so much poverty, but the distance between the rich and the poor. You will clearly get after the presentation that I'm not an economist, even though I've been trying to understand the language of economics. But so far, the only thing that one listens to, even as a citizen, is that agreement in inequalities, we'd have to do something. The only thing that one listens to, income redistribution. First of all, as if inequalities were an economical thing. Well, they are, but not only. It's far more than that. It's cultural, it's racial, it's social. So let's say it's a much more complex, the question of inequalities, than the economical one. But even if it only was that, I guess you will agree on this, that it will take a lot of time if for correcting inequalities we just depend on income redistribution. It will require education. Because of the education, better access to better paid jobs. If you have a better job, instead of getting a subsidized house somewhere in a periphery and being in an awful public transportation system, spending a couple of hours a day, accumulating anger and resentment, and if you have a better salary, you may choose where to live instead of being given something where to live, and eventually have a car, go in a paid highway in the city. In the meantime, what? So this is why cities, if we identify strategically projects of infrastructure, public space, public transportation, or housing, we can improve quality of life without having to depend entirely on income redistribution. Imagine what it would be if in a state-of-the-art public transportation system, in the same house you're somewhere in the periphery, with the same job, in the same time, the same distance from where you have something to do, study or work, you're seated in the bus, heated or with air conditioning in the summer. Eventually you can sleep on the bus instead of being crushed standing for 2 hours on your way in or on your way back. Does it cost money? Of course it costs money, but compared to other measures, it is a way to improve quality of life in a relatively short period of time. Public space, extremely efficient in redistributing quality of life. You don't have a good job and just on survival mode. Of course you don't have time, let's say, to have holidays or to even spend a vacation. Cities are measured for what you can do in them for free. best public spaces should be in the worst peripheries of our cities, and in that way offer to a family at the very beginning or at the very end of the day some moment of relief, some moment of enjoying life. I don't have it here, but imagine Rio de Janeiro with the beach. At that moment, you don't need anything. The rich guy of the Ipanema penthouse and in the favela that is actually close by, you're on the beach half naked enjoying life. And this is the kind of thing that for a moment a day, I guess, creates a moment of relief, and it's an experience of social and urban equality. So in principle, people coming to cities is good news. The problem is what I call the 3S menace. The scale, speed, and scarcity of means with which we will have to respond to the phenomenon of migration towards cities has no precedence in human history. So, this, you know more better than me that these numbers, but just to understand that we're on the same page. Out of the 3 and a little bit more billion people living in cities today, 1 billion is under the line of poverty. By 2030, out of the 5 billion people living in cities, 2 billion are going to be under the line of poverty. This means that we will have to build a 1 million people city per week with more or less $10,000 per family. And this is the thing. Do we have the knowledge to solve that equation? Not really. So there's a big need, a big challenge in architecture particularly, and in city design, to attract brilliant minds to be able to solve that equation. We're not attracting good minds to be able to create knowledge to solve that equation. If we don't solve that equation, it is not that people will stop coming to cities. They will come anyhow, but they will live in awful conditions, in slums and informal settlements and favelas. So, by that, we may be accumulating a huge social pressure. So cities, if we don't solve it, will be huge social ticking time bombs. Despite at the core of people coming to cities is good news for the poor, in the sense that any public policy with people concentrated in space is more efficient to improve people's quality of life, even though it may be counterintuitive. Maybe for experts not, but for an average citizens, the overcrowding and the congestion of cities are just the opposite of quality of life. But then you go to numbers, and of course it's rather easy to submit evidence to show and prove that we will that it is more efficient having cities concentrated in space than spread outside of it. So, as I said, if we don't solve this equation, people won't stop coming to cities. It is so new. We don't have enough knowledge and approaches, but in any case, we still may think that it is a state's responsibility and task to do so, deliver or come up with more intelligent public policies and sharp public policies, or the market delivering efficiency. Well, even if both of them come up with the best possible version for a public policy or for a market operation, we won't even be close to achieve those numbers unless we include people's own capacity that shouldn't be resisted but channeled through design. So it's about being able to create the right frame so that people is part of the solution and not part of the problem. We tend to see a slum as part of the problem, as something that needs to be resisted, or ultimately as an incapacity of a family to provide themselves with decent shelter. I would say it's just the opposite. Despite not having any kind of formal aid, Islam is a proof that there is a capacity there. There are resources there. The scarcest resource actually is not money, but coordination. Coordinated efforts have to be guaranteed by somebody. This is actually a design's task, to be able to come up with an efficient, with a strategic form of the urban footprint, so that individual initiatives can be channeled and add to that open incremental system. Let's say, if you can't do anything right now, focus on what's more difficult to be achieved individually and on what will have a bigger consequence on the common good in the future. There are ways to do that, not necessarily the way architecture has been operated. We tend to be control freaks. This should be the other way around, an open system and just some things guaranteed, common good, and then allow the thing to take a life on its own afterwards. So incrementality, openness, and what in a recent conversation with Joan Claus hitting the UN 3 Habitat Conference in Quito that happens every 20 years in October, which will set the urban agenda, eventually come up with some recommendations and specific knowledge for this solving this equation. This is a very technical thing. I put it in this form. Get the Nolli right. Nolli is an architect of the 1700s, Giambattista Nolli, that was working for the church, creating a map of Rome to be able to understand who to tax and who not to tax. And then he drew a map that was just black and white. White, public space; black, those that have to pay taxes, private space. And because of that, 300 years ago, it was a very clear way to look at the city footprint. So I will show it afterwards. The thing is about looking at this as an individual capacity, not an incapacity, that should be channeled through the designs in our cities. What is there? This is a footprint of Islam. It could be anywhere. I think this is Kibera, actually. One of the things that is striking is that if you take a look at the public-private land ratio, this is less than 1 to 10. From 10 is a really good case. I mean, it can drop down up to 1%. So the space to circulate mainly, that's the only public space that you get. If you look at Manhattan, it's 1 to 1. Per every square meter of public land, there's one private land meter that is developable. So if you can achieve more or less those numbers for 30% up of the urban footprint as public space, eventually individual actions can be a vehicle to development. Whatever you do there can gain value over time instead of going down in terms of value, quality of life, and so on and so forth. So this is the Nolli representation. If you get the Nolli right, the property structure right, then Manhattan at some point was a slum too. So we should focus less on the aesthetical quality of the building, but get a couple of fundamentals right and eventually channel through the city this individual capacity. So again, scarcity resource coordination, not money. Some of the projects that we've been testing following this, introducing in between public and private, the collective, and this is another clue that it's very important in poor environments. If you do so, and this is one of the projects that we have done, where by not having enough money, evidence shows that a middle-class family can live reasonably well in around 80 square meters, beyond numbers. Would I live reasonably well in 80 square meters? We have asked ourselves this question in the office many times. The answer is yes. We could live well in around 80 square meters. We actually live in around like that. But the money that is available, be it in the form of public savings or public policy, it's half of that. More in the best of the cases, you can pay about 40 square meters. What markets tend to do is to look, or states to look at 40 square meters as a small house. You know, take a middle-class family and shrink it to a small, tiny, good-looking house of 40 square meters in the periphery. So reducing and displacing in the periphery where land costs nothing. So one of the clues of this incremental approach, of this open approach, is why don't we look at the 40 square meters, which is a fact, not as a small house, but as half of a good one. As soon as you reframe 40 square meters, not as a small house, but as half of a good one, the key question is, which half do we do? And the answer is focus on the half that a family won't be able to achieve on its own. And we identified a set of 5 design conditions that belong to the half that cannot be changed individually, no matter how much time, goodwill you put into the house. Number 1, location. The key question in social housing or to accommodate people is not how much, how big, it's where. Where in the cities is social housing? How close to the concentration of opportunities? If by getting a house, families are included in the network of opportunities of cities, and they do not lose their jobs, for example, the process of achieving the middle class standard with their own resources happens rather quickly. Actually, according to our experience, over the weekend. If we open one of these complexes on a Friday, by Monday you go and take a picture and it looks like that. Or in the reconstruction after the earthquake in Chile in Constitución, that was the first project we did in 2003. This is the last one where we did in Chile. Again, another part of the difficult thing to achieve individually is structure. Structure for the final scenario, not for the first half only. Mexico. Or in the recently opened Venice Biennale, at the more bigger scale, and again for immigration in this case, a project by Bell Architects in Berlin. So this is not only a problem of us, Latin American or underdeveloped countries. Who would have thought that this now is also everybody's problem? Some other clues also presented at the Venice Biennale, the Kumbmela, an instant city built in 3 months for 5 million people. 100 million people go through this religious festival city that takes place every 12 years. And after 55 days, it disappears into the Ganges after the monsoon arrives. So, if it was not difficult enough to build the 1 million people city per week with $10,000 per family, which I don't think we have enough knowledge in the world, and we're desperately in need for that. So that is, if we don't solve it, we have these problems with accumulating poor, bad living conditions. Not recent ago, some people approach us, and also by the gathering of people at the Biennale, we never thought about it. If we solve it, we have a problem too. If we solve it, building in the way we're building today, using all the building techniques that are available in the world today, if we eventually build for all these people, the 1 million people city per week, then our planet is over. The carbon footprint of the building industry in the way we know it today will leave us with no planet. So at this point, we're in such a challenge that if we don't solve it, we have a human problem. If we solve it, we have an environmental problem. So I guess we will, again, on this other side, need to create new knowledge, new approaches, because business as usual, even if well-intentioned, will create another catastrophe. So we need to come up with new strategies in order to have a better carbon footprint. And one could be seen or described as the high-tech approach, state-of-the-art engineering, and the other one I would call it the hand-tech approach. So regarding the high-tech, there are some new advancement in plastics. I mean, again, extremely counterintuitive, and instead of burning fuel to produce cement, steel, we can use the plastic, which may be much more efficient, using much less matter to achieve resistance. That would be one way. Another example I will show afterwards at the Venice Biennale, prevent bending. Bending is a force that in a beam, I mean, like this straight line in here, we tend to identify with the most efficient achievements of modernity, that we finally have flat slabs and straight beams, where the lower part of the beam tends to bend. You know, this movement that it tends to fall down because there's something here around that's called gravity. Well, the lower part requires steel to prevent that movement, and there's a lot of cement around the steel not working at all in terms of resistance, but just to protect the corrosion of steel. If you avoid that, we can save up to 70% of the matter of a building while going back to old knowledge like volts and arcs. The other way, the other path of the hand tech or the no tech, besides being labor intensive, which is extremely crucial in the building industry, the more efficient you are, the more social conflicts you may be creating, is to go back to natural materials and to local labor, natural materials that will require change in the legislation. We do have a knowledge today, but on all our building codes throughout the world, earth is banned, bamboo is banned, the vegetal steel, as somebody calls them. So, some examples again from just last Saturday. Golden Lion at the Venice Biennale, an architect from Paraguay. If you're able to build a nice building in Paraguay, then there's no excuses in the rest of the world not to do it. I mean, the most adverse circumstances only using brick and non-qualified labor. At the other end of the spectrum, Lord Foster building a brick vault for a drone port in Africa, or extremely high-tech engineering from MIT, ETH, and Cambridge, this vault not using one single drop of cement or connected, and these are the guys that are saving up to 70% of the matter by avoiding bending. Natural materials like rammed earth by Anna Heringer, or bamboo by Simone Velis, or the floating school. If you don't have the infrastructure on the roads, just bring the school through the river and use the rivers on highways. So there are very different strategies, and just not that these are the only ones, just to name a rather fresh one that was open 4 days ago in Venice. So just to finalize, giving this kind of path with forces that eventually are pulling in opposite directions, if there's any power in architecture, I would say that's the power of synthesis. We may not write reports, we may not write essays, but that's why I was asking about the do tank. We organize all these forces at play and take the risk to make a proposal. We may fail, of course we may fail, we iterate, then try it again. Ask people. Ask people and include them in the participatory design process, not to expect from them the answers. We should ask people to understand what is the question. There's nothing worse than answering well the wrong question. So we tend to believe and think that we know the question. And this, I guess, is one of the biggest mistakes that we tend to be doing as architects. So I guess, in any case, the more complex, the more far away from architecture the starting point, the better. There's a moment, which I think that's why architecture is an art, where you have to combine intelligence and intuition. There's a jump into the void. All of a sudden, all these forces are at play. Eventually, if you're rigorous, balancing inventiveness and pertinence, eventually we may organize all this in a proposal key and deliver some projects, and I hope we architects will be able to contribute to this shared debate with the specific knowledge of our discipline. Thank you so much.
Alejandro, I think that's a fantastic expose in a very short space of time. I would like you to stop thinking of your questions quick. In the meantime, what I'd like to ask you is, it's a very prosaic question, which links some of the difficulties that can arise. In much of what you've had to do, you have had to interact with a lot of actors in spaces. And I remember last year being in New York and meeting a group of people who had worked on regenerating New Jersey after hurricanes that hit there. And they managed to federate people who often are very difficult to federate. So different levels of government, different actors, economic actors and other public policy actors, who in a sense you'd have to reconcile in order to be able to move forward with what you've presented in a very stark and rational way, but that human beings then sometimes start thinking about themselves, their own interests. Have you confronted that, and how have you, in a sense, gone about federating? What's the secret that you've been able to bring?
I'm not sure I understand the word federating.
bringing people together, so getting them to actually agree around
they
something
agree.
and
Okay.
arrive at a consensus that normally they might not like each other. They're from
Yeah.
different political parties. They have different interests.
Yes.
There's a trade union, there's a business community, etc. And they may not have a natural alliance of interests that are all aligned. They need aligning.
Yes, yes, yes. No, I think every single project that we do is like that. So one example that I think it's very clear in that is the reconstruction of the city of Constitucion after earthquake and tsunami. 2010, 8.8 Richter scale earthquake, which Chile resists rather well. We know how to react to this at the scale of a building, which is the earthquake. We didn't know what to do at the scale of the entire city, which is the tsunami. So, of course, when you have a city destroyed by 80%, it's the moment, even though it's a cliche, it's a window of opportunity that one wouldn't like to miss. Should we change here something in the city? So, knowing that there was this window of opportunity at such a vast scale in a rather short period of time, 100 days to deliver any kind of advice for how to rebuild. If you just rebuild, you will be making the same mistake again. So there was the need to innovate. We understood that we had to open the process to the people, to the entire city. Of course, this is counterintuitive because if you have very little time and very little resources, the more you ask people, then the reaction is, okay, this is going to slow down even more. Things are going to become even more complicated, and this may create a political threat to the entire process. In any case, there was a lot of trust, and we did that despite all the difficulties. Why was it so difficult? We never did something in the design of our cities to resist a tsunami. Then the first debate was, let's forbid installation on ground zero. This is actually what's being discussed in Japan today. I mean, if there's a dangerous area close to the sea, do not allow people to install themselves on ground zero again. And if you have a disciplined population like the Japanese, you may succeed. In Chile, we knew this was not going to happen. It will be taken illegally, so politically and technically speaking, it was irresponsible. In any case, $30 million mainly in land expropriation, 3 blocks away from the river that couldn't be used in the future. Alternative 2, conveniently lobbied by the big building industry, one big contract, big wall to protect the city against the tsunami, $42 million, politically preferred, no land expropriation, because you build the protection exactly in the line where the city was dividing with the river. But since we have the community involved in understanding the question, not the answer, when we asked the people what would they prefer, before going into A, B, or our intuition was saying C, we said, what else should we be looking at here? Now we have this window of opportunity. What bothers you? And in these forums, where the first thing we did was to build physically a place in the main square so that the discussions about the city in the future will take place in the city. Of course, there were no communications, so unless you made a very physical thing, it wouldn't move ahead. So people were saying, we're very thankful for you thinking about the tsunami, but you know what? The next one is going to happen in what? 20 years? 30 years? Every single year, this city floods because of the rain. We do not have a proper system to channel all the waters coming into the basin. So whatever you do, just make sure that you do something with the water of the rain. In addition to that, our public space sucks. I mean, we're in the middle of the forest region in this country, and they felt it, we measured it, they didn't know, 2.2 square meters per inhabitant. Recommendations say 9. A middle-class neighborhood in Chile will have 7. A rich neighborhood in Santiago will have 18 square meters per inhabitant. London has 44 square meters of public space, green space per inhabitant. So whatever you do, let's make sure you improve the public space ratio per inhabitant in the city. Finally, and this I think was the most difficult thing to understand that could have been an advantage. There was a concern in the government about the identity, or let's say the old buildings that fell. If you build too fast, you may threaten the quality of the built environment, the quality of life, and actually affect the identity of the city. And people said, and of course in Chile, it's not that we had buildings like after a bombing in Germany that they knew exactly where each stone was. This was just old architecture, not bad, but nothing special. I mean, we're not known for our world-class heritage of old architecture, like Peru that have the Incas, or it was not our case. So there were just old buildings that fell. If we even want to reconstruct them, we wouldn't know how to do that. There were no surveys of that architecture. But in any case, what people said is, you know what? A pity that buildings fell, but our identity is not connected to architecture, but to nature, to geography. The origin of the city is the river. Let's make sure in whatever you do that you give publics democratic access to the river that up to that point was privately owned by 15 families or something like that. So after asking people, we understood that the real question of the city was fourfold, not just onefold. I mean, eventually we may have responded efficiently to the tsunami protection, build the thing, spend $42 million, and then have riots on the street. People said, we don't like this. I mean, it's fair because it was not their problem. It may be our problem, or they should have known it's their problem, but they have other issues as well. Of course, then we said the right approach here is, instead of resisting the energy of nature that Japan proved to be useless, let's try to dissipate the energy of a tsunami, and against the geographical threat, let's come up with the geographical answer. A forest in between the city and the sea that introduces some friction and reduces the energy of the waves by 50%. By doing so, we improved the public space ratio from 2 to 7 square meters. We laminated the water in the park so that we prevented the flooding. Of course, were more efficient in terms of a tsunami, and provided, finally, democratic access to the river. The cost of this, $48 million. So in that sense, it's more expensive. But when we made a survey of the public investment system and understood that there were 5 different projects of 4 different ministries for the same place, without knowing that this was taking place, and that's why I say scarce resource in cities is coordination, not money, the sum of these 5 projects, $52 million. So the power of synthesis of architecture is to understand, first of all, the complexity of the question, and once you did that, integrate that in one single operation that actually saved $4 million.
Thank you. I have a problem. We do not have much time left because we have President Bachelet, who is going to start speaking at 10 o'clock. So I apologize because we won't have had questions, but Alejandro is going to be around for a little while. Last thing I want to do is very quickly show you, Alejandro, the results that we've had so far from the Better Life Index poll, essentially, of what is most important to people in terms of their quality of life. And if you look down that list, there are a number of elements that you have touched on in the presentation that you've made. So when we're looking at quality of life and well-being, which is an area of big focus for the OECD, and the do tank element, which is how to deliver, there seems to be a lot of connection there with what you've been discussing today. It's very difficult to conclude a session like this because it's been quite extraordinary in terms of the issues that, Alejandro, you have raised. I would like to thank you very much, apologize to the audience because you haven't been able to come in with your questions. Thank you all for coming so early as well.